As you can tell from the title and thumbnail of this video, I have an argument to lay to rest. I want to put my ball in the ring and talk about why Tasha's Hideous Laughter may not be the card that you think it is. I want to talk about some pros and cons and mostly just provide two big arguments against the playability of Tasha's Hideous Laughter. Now, if you're a modern player that doesn't play Mill, or heck, even a pauper player of this channel, I think this will be a great discussion just to see where the state of modern is, the playability of certain cards, and the axis to which they need to attack to really be relevant in today's current modern metagame. So join me as I talk about one of modern Mill's most controversial and powerful cards printed in recent memory. Now, the card itself, whether you've seen it or not, is, as I mentioned, really powerful. I will give it that. Whether it's playable or not is a discussion and a real conclusion that I want to draw to by the end of this video. But it's powerful. Blue and 1 sorcery. Each opponent exiles cards from the top of their library until that player has exiled cards with a total mana value of 20 or more. So it's very much a feast or famine type of card, bringing in an element of randomness in an archetype that really already works with one of the most unpredictable axes of win conditions in the game, drawing from the randomness to which is the library. You can't control ultimately what you draw off the top of your deck. There obviously are cards that allow you to manipulate that, but those cards have drawbacks. They are limited. Whatever it might be, Wizards of the Coast has done a relatively good job of, well, again, randomizing and controlling how we can manipulate the top of our libraries, and therefore Mill itself is not really a predicted archetype. You can mill over all your opponent's lands one game and then mill over all their worst cards, giving them access to exactly what you need. So Tasha's Hideous Laughter exacerbates that point, and it's really good against some decks and not. So I want to present to you my first argument as to why Tasha's Hideous Laughter, in my opinion, is not a great card in modern Mill whatsoever. And that really is the fact that the card needs to do more. You need to have multiple axes of play and be relevant in multiple situations to be, again, relevant in the modern Mill deck and in modern in general. I want to go back to some cards that were previously playable in modern Mill, mostly because we didn't have other options. I want to talk about two cards in particular. First one is going to be Glimpse the Unthinkable. Glimpse the Unthinkable, blue and black, for a sorcery that says target player mills 10 cards. Now, this was again at a time where Commander wasn't a big focus of Magic in general, so the idea of saying each opponent wasn't really relevant. They weren't designing cards for Commander. So if that was a thing now, I think Glimpse the Unthinkable would be redesigned at this point. And technically speaking, we did have that. We have had that redesign in many ways, but that's not the topic of the conversation. Glimpse the Unthinkable was just 2 mana to mill 10 cards. It did nothing more, nothing less. It didn't have instant speed attached to it. It didn't mill more depending on conditions. It didn't mill less depending on conditions. And it was a great way to enable different things, such as Jace's Phantasm, which is actually funny in a world of, well, Fury, because Jace's Phantasm goes to a 5/5, which actually notably gets out of Fury range, doesn't block it too well, but I mean, it trades with it. So Jace's Phantasm is kind of funny in that case, but again, a win more type of card. Jace's Phantasm specifically, Glimpse the Unthinkable just didn't have it there, but 2 of them enabled a Visions of Beyond, and it just milled a lot of cards to feed into a Surgical, or it was just great on turn 2 versus Tron to put a lot of cards into yard. It did many things that cards now can't do in Mill. We don't have a 2 mana mill spell, so on rate it wasn't bad, but there are other things that you wanted to do at that slot. I mean, against decks that are playing up the beanstalk at 2 mana and drawing that many cards, I mean, you really have to do more, because when your opponent is just turning cards into mini ancestrals and divinations for free, what are you doing at 10? Well, milling them for 10 at 2 mana. Glimpse the Unthinkable, in my opinion, has great flavor text, just is not that relevant anymore, especially with Drown in the Loch, as I was mentioning. You really want to be doing Drown on 2 or playing Crabs on 2 instead of Glimpse on 2. Now, the next card I want to talk about is Mesmeric Orb. Mesmeric Orb was actually, surprisingly in many ways is relevant now as well, but more so in a time where people actually cast spells for mana. We're in an age of free spells and power creep things, in an age where people were playing collected companies and casting cards for their rate, and heck, look at the elves decks, tapping 3 elves to generate 3 mana. This was the great time for Mesmeric Orb because there was a lot of things untapping on our opponent's side, a lot of groups of things that had to come together to have collective effects, whereas now we have cards that individually by themselves do so much. I mean, look at Ragavan. We're gonna mill them for 1 off of Ragavan, but they've stolen a card from us and ramped 1. It's just not doing exactly what we needed to. Mesmeric Orb be colorless, and for 2, it also milled ourselves, so we could always, crypt ourselves for our own crabs. We could feed our visions ourselves, but it was that weird card to implement, especially in the mirror match, which does come up. Mesmeric Orb was a very dicey card to take advantage of in that case. But really what I'm trying to get to is rate. Is both of those cards on rate? I would say Mesmeric Orb more so now is less on rate, but used to be more on rate. Tomescar is a great example of this. You pay 1 and you mill 5, and Glimpse the Unthinkable is pay 2, mill 10. And so based on this logic of how card designers work, I would like to think that Wizards used to have this design philosophy of, with mill, every mana cost would generally require or give you 5 cards milled. And so with Tasha's Hideous Laughter being 3, you would think, well, okay, on average you would want to be exiling 15 cards, which honestly isn't that great for a sorcery. Technically speaking, as the mana value of a card goes up, you would want it to do more and more exponentially because you have to cast it later and later in the game. You can't cast it in tandem with other cards. It doesn't have a mana reduction, so on and so forth. So you would hope that cards have exponential value as their mana cost increases. I hope many of you understand that the difference between 0 and 1 mana is insane. The difference between 1 and 2 so as well. But then with this Tomescar logic, even Hedron Crab is something where, even though it only mills 3, the long game potential and blocking is very important. It has multiple facets to it. Hedron Crab is a blocker, a magnet for removal, as well as a mill spell. It does more than Tomescar, Glimpse the Unthinkable, and Mesmeric Orb. So can Tasha's do that? I mean, I've included Ruin Crab in here because this thing blocks Ragavan like a boss and gets around stuff like the One Ring thanks to that. But is Tomescour the rate at which we want to be milling cards? Well, let's take a look at a chart provided by the Mill Discord itself. So shout out to AltaBiscuit for actually posting this themselves. This is actually a great Python script available in the Mill Discord, where you can input a deck list, the numbers themselves, and it gives you a spread of the amount of cards that Tasha's Hideous Laughter would actually mill against that deck. So if we look at it, we want to look at this small little pip, right? So I'm going to blow it up here a little bit. We want to look at this small little pip in the middle, and that is the exact average. The blue line is the general spread, and the lines themselves on the side are the extremes to my understanding. And so we can tell that a large majority, if we just pop up large majority of decks, if we were to cast Tasha's Hideous Laughter against them in the blind, a large majority of them would be below rate. They would be within the regular averages, but including the yellow lines themselves, below. Domain Zoo, Tron, Rhinos, Creativity, Omnath, Living End. I mean, like even Scam being up here just below the 15, just not doing enough for you. Imagine if you exile 2 Furies, that's already 10 of your 20 CMC gone. Tasha's Hideous Laughter on average is not above the rate that Wizards of the Coast has set per mana value of milled cards anyway. And as I was mentioning, you would hope, exponentially speaking, the card would mill more per mana value because, again, you are casting it later, you are not able to cast it in tandem with other cards, and again, it doesn't have any mana reduction. So the card is not on rate. It does not do more. It does not have an alternative motive other than, well, it does exile cards, which you can argue does more. But later in this video, I'm actually going to argue that exiling may not actually be what we want the card to do. So looking at this modern metagame, Rakdos Scam, Yawgmoth, Beanstalk, Footfalls, 4-color Omnath, Chiron, and I'm ignoring Titan because it plays a lot of lands, Boros Burn because it's an aggro deck, and these are things that I'm going to touch on later, so don't worry. This isn't just a negative fest on Tasha's. The card isn't on rate. The card doesn't do more, which I'll touch on with the exile, with this next argument here. You need to ultimately stick to the plan, and this is where I think a lot of mill players get it confused. The objective of the game is to mill your opponent's deck over, get them to draw from an empty library, but you do so because that's your objective, but your plan is to put cards into the graveyard. in Modern, at least. Obviously, you know, your opponents can draw cards, and forcing them to draw and all that stuff is fine. You take cards out of their library, but you have to have a strategy and a plan to do that. The plan is to put the cards into the graveyard, because that is how the reward system has been designed by Wizards of the Coast to affect and positively bring up the mill archetype. So we have to take advantage of the resources that is provided to us. I mean, Drown in the Loch, very simple example of one of the most powerful removal spells ever printed, in my opinion, in Modern in general. A counter spell stuck onto a removal spell that can do either or. Feed your Drown in the Loch, because cards are important in the graveyard. Cards are more impactful in the graveyard for us. Crypt Incursion, one of the only solutions, one of the best solutions against any creature or graveyard strategies. Crypt Incursion is one of the sole reasons why creature decks cannot stand up to mill. One of the reasons why combo decks, many of them, cannot stand up to mill. Why Living End, why Dredge, why these decks could not stand up against mill. These are one of these slam dunk cards against this. Crypt Incursion requires that cards are in the graveyard. Cards in the graveyard are more impactful than cards in exile. Visions of Beast, I don't need to talk about this. It is literally ancestral on a card if cards are in graveyard. Cards are more impactful in the graveyard than they are in exile. Jace the Perfected Mind. I mean, sure, it's like a bad Fractured Sanity and it's got some combat tricks, which are both very relevant modes, but the -2 cards are, say it with me, put it down in the comments if you are this far in the video. Cards are more impactful in the graveyard than they are in exile, because of the reward systems provided to us by Wizards of the Coast. Until I can draw 3 cards for the amount of exiled cards in my opponent's exile zone, then I do not care what you think about cards being exiled. Cards are more impactful for us in the graveyard than in exile. Look at God. Surgical Extraction is the only reason that mill is relevant today. Mark my words. Surgical Extraction, Extirpate are the only reasons why mill has able to compete in the modern ecosphere in general, stopping combo decks, fragile synergy decks, anything, getting rid of your opponent's biggest, most important piece. Heck, when you're playing with Tasha's Hideous Laughter, exile opponent's Murktide from their Isn't Murktide deck, and all of a sudden it's Tasha's feeding time. Surgical Extraction makes it so cards in graveyard are more impactful than cards in exile. Stick to the plan, put cards into your opponent's graveyard. Wrenn and 6 is going to be a card that takes advantage of that. So what? That's information for us, because ultimately we know what their plan is. We know that they're not going to be minusing us as long as cards are in graveyard. They're going to be targeting specific lands, so we can then use that information to see what they're fetching for. We can then use those to be surgical targets if we wanted to. We can then activate in response to the activation of the +1 of our, graveyard hate artifacts. And even the -7, that's a bait as well. If you're holding up a piece of interaction like a Soul Guide Lantern against their graveyard, they cannot -7. Cards in graveyard are more impactful than cards in exile. Endurance, cards in graveyard are more impactful than cards in exile, because we are forcing them to take cards out of their deck to play cards like Endurance, which are notably very powerful, to stop us. They need to lose a card in hand, they need to then play an Endurance, and then this needs to resolve, and its ETB needs to resolve. So many things need to happen for this Endurance to matter, and therefore your opponent is playing to your plan. A lot of the times, if you play things right, and it sometimes doesn't happen, that's fine. Statistically speaking, decks that play Endurance usually have a better matchup against mill, and that's fine, above 50%, but they are playing your game because they need to stop you and what you're doing. Cards are more impactful in graveyards than they're impactful in exile. Dragon's Rage Channeler has a fun little niche scenario, especially against the Murktide matchup, where you want Delirium in their graveyard. You know why? Ensnaring Bridge, because then that allows you to have a bigger grip against a resolved Murktide, against a resolved Dragon's Rage Channeler. It allows you to hold more cards, more answers, more things to plan with. I'm talking about niche scenarios that actually provide you real percentage points against decks. Karn the Great Creator wants you to exile cards. Imagine exiling artifacts away like Wormcoil Engine into their exile. Karn the Great Creator does not only reveal cards from outside the game, aka sideboard, it also gets our artifacts that are exiled face up in your exile zone. Cards are more impactful in graveyards than in exile. Visions of Beyond, it's just a card that I want to repeat. I understand that we've been cutting copies of this card in the main board of mill But ultimately speaking, having Ancestral, having the Surgical, having these explosive moments where we can just neuter decks in terms of just sinking the behind card advantage and stopping their combos, it's really important that cards stay in graveyard and we manipulate and we control and we funnel what our opponents can do with their graveyard. We are the control decks. I control what you can do with your deck. You control what you can do with your hand in your battlefield, and I will try and play that game with you. But ultimately, as a mill player, you have to think that you have to be the one in control of what your opponent is doing with their deck and their graveyard, not their hand and their battlefield, not the visible zones. The unknown is up to you. That is where you control the game. Now, those are my two big arguments. I do want to go over a brief section as to why I think the card is good, why it has staying power in mill right now, and some of the better suits of it. Tasha's Hideous Laughter does a lot of things, and there's two big things that I want to highlight. First and foremost, it attacks the group. It says each opponent, which is very relevant in a world of hexproof effects, protection, especially the One Ring, where decks aren't necessarily playing cards like Veil of Summer or Leyline of Sanctity, although Veil of Summer does come up in decks like the 5-color domain decks, or the Leyline of Sanctity can come up against the Living End matchup that wants to tech against burn a bit more. The One Ring is very important in many matchups, and so getting around this protection is actually very important if you have it in the main board. I probably wouldn't be playing Tasha's in the decks, playing against it post board against the decks that play One Ring, but I'm getting ahead of myself. It's also very good against aggro. If you look at a deck like Hardened Scales that have a lot of 0 CMC things, Welding Jars, Hangerback Walker, Walking Ballistas, the lands are 0 themselves. And a lot of these 1 mana things too, with Zabaz or Shadow Spear or the Hardened Scales. A lot of these cards that have very low CMC, Tasha's is going to have an insane value against them. I mean, look at the chart again. Look at the Scales chart and how far that is. On average, Scales is going to be milling anywhere between like 26, 27 cards at the extreme. Behind my camera, it's milling over like 35 at the minimum. It's milling 20. That is way more on rate than the average CMC that we've seen, and that is exactly what we want. That is exactly what we want out of a card like this, and so that's why it's powerful. But in a modern metagame that's playing a lot of high CMC things like Fury, Endurance, Shieldred, like Force of Vigor, I don't know why they would bring that in against us. Fable of the Mirror Breaker, Blood Moon's in there somewhere as well. A lot of these high CMC spells that are played in high density. It's not just one of Endurance, it's usually 3 to 4. It's not one Fury, it's 4. A lot of these high CMC, high density cards and decks, it's very hard to justify Tasha's in the main board anymore, and I think that's where I stand. I don't think Tasha's is mainboardable anymore, and that is my general recommendation. I highly recommend bringing Tasha's to the sideboard in a general metagame. Going to a competitive event or just playing in the leagues, I think Tasha's serves the mill deck better in the sideboard. I think Tasha's is great against burn, against scales, but if you're not seeing those that often, why play it? Now, this is not a recommendation for your local metagame. If you go to your LGS and you have a lot of players that are playing burn, playing scales, then play Tasha's in the main board. A lot of Hammer Time players play Tasha's in the main board. You're going to get a lot of value out of it. But we're seeing a lot of these winners metagames in the challenges, in top tournaments, that are seeing a lot of 4-color, a lot of Murktide, a lot of scales, a lot of not scales, a lot of Scam, a lot of Yawgmoth, decks that don't get affected to the rate that you want Tasha's to affect them at all. It just doesn't do the power that it does. So I highly recommend trying Tasha's in the sideboard, playing another Jace or 2 in the main board, playing Spell Pierces main. Those Spell Pierces are great against many non-creature spells, especially the burn decks, and has a ton of utility against scales as well. So there are options for you. Tasha's isn't so bad that it's gone from the deck, but I don't think in this current modern metagame for many reasons, that it sticks to the plan, that it's on rate for what we need. So put it in the sideboard because we only need it against some key matchups. That's what I gotta say.